Hello and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. My name is Sarah Small and I'm Food Tank's Global Events Director. I'm really excited about today's webinar with Dan Charles. Dan is a food and agriculture correspondent with National Public Radio, or as we all know it better, NPR. Today, his presentation will discuss the opportunities and challenges of telling stories about what happens to food before it ever gets to your supermarket or local farmer's market. He'll describe his latest project, which is focused on seasonal foods and the workers who harvest them. This webinar will be recorded and posted on foodtank.com later today. You can also follow along and participate on Twitter using hashtag #FoodTank. And please submit your questions throughout the course of the webinar. We'll have about 10-15 minutes at the end for an awesome Q&A session. You can send your questions to sarah@foodtank.com, send them in your chat box, or also on Twitter. So without further ado, Dan, it's truly an honor to have you here today, and I'm excited to hear your presentation. I will give you the floor now.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And it's nice to be here. Thanks to Food Tank for setting this up, the wonders of technology. I can talk to some unseen bunch of people out there. I hope you're there. Maybe you're there. We'll find out when the question time comes. I hope there's lots of questions. It'd be nice if there was, if we could leave lots of time for that. So I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I am Dan Charles. I come to this topic through a bit of a circuitous route. I did grow up on a farm. I grew up on a dairy farm in Pennsylvania, but that's not the kind of thing that I was at first interested in doing when I got into journalism. I fell by accident into science writing. And then in the course of, that beat, when I was working for a magazine called New Scientist here in Washington, D.C., I kind of gravitated toward stories that did involve agriculture, farming, food. I remember in the 1990s, actually the 1980s, doing stories about some of the early experiments with genetic engineering of seeds, for instance, and questions about patent protection of seeds, also stories about environmental impact of agriculture. And those were very interesting to me. I tended to kind of do more of those stories, came over to NPR in the 90s, also as a kind of science and technology reporter, continued doing that, ended up leaving NPR, writing a book about the origin of genetically modified crops, and then another one that involved nitrogen and its global impacts. Long story short, came back to NPR 4 years ago when they found some money to set up a more of a food and agriculture beat here. And that's been my job. And the central kind of story that I try to do in this beat is tell a story that's not obvious to the consumer when he or she goes into the store and picks something off the shelf, or when you go to your farmer's market and buy something. There's a lot of really interesting stories that went into the creation of that food. And I'll go through some of the kinds of stories that I've done, and then I'll talk a little bit more about my recent project involving farm workers. So I am going to now switch over and show you some pictures as I talk. So let's see if this works. I believe it is working.
That
So
looks great, yeah.
That's just the title. So this is the scene you may be familiar with. You go to the farmer's market, you pick up some fruit. I believe in this case it's a bag of apples. This is Sydney Kuhn at a farmer's market here in Washington, D.C., selling some apples from her orchard up in Pennsylvania. So that's what you get, right? And you got your fresh local food and you're very happy about it. But there's lots of stories behind that scene. This is David Bedford at the University of Minnesota, and he's looking through some old log books from the breeding plots in the apple breeding program at Minnesota. He and a colleague are the people who found, discovered, created, patented the Honeycrisp apple. And we're actually looking at the page in the sort of research book that's describing his first, I think it's his observations when he first tasted the Honeycrisp and decided, hey, this is interesting. This might have a future. So that's a story of the plant breeding that went into, the apple, for instance. Or another example. This is a farm up in Pennsylvania, and we're spreading manure. Maybe not the most appetizing thing right before lunch, but here's a story about, for instance, nitrogen and fertility, and also food safety. Questions of, when can you put manure on your field? Should it be allowed at all? Very hot topic for the Food and Drug Administration. But that fertilizer, that's absolutely essential and a crucial part of producing food. Another example. I took all these pictures, by the way, from different reporting trips here and there. This is out in western Kansas, and it's nighttime, but these folks are hard at work building a mountain of corn. That is at a feedlot in Hoxie, the town of Hoxie. And this is harvest time, and they're laying up, feed that's gonna, fatten up the cattle. So it's a story about animal feed, but in this particular area, it's also a story about water resources. Around Hoxie, a group of farmers in a 99 square mile area have agreed in a sort of unprecedented way to altogether reduce their pumping of water from the aquifer by, I think it was 20%, because the aquifer's disappearing. So the water is the source of the corn that you see there, which in turn is the source of the meat, the beef that might show up in your supermarket. These are real people and real places associated with, the food that we eat. Onward. This is obviously pigs, young pigs. And the issue that I was exploring in this story is the health of the pigs. And to what extent do farmers like Craig Rolls, I think this is, to what extent do they use antibiotics? To what extent is that necessary? And does that have implications for the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria? It's a familiar topic, I'm sure, to many of you, listening today. Where do our chickens live? The chickens that lay our eggs. You can see a young man gathering eggs in the background. That's not what you actually want. This is a, cage-free chicken house. The chickens are supposed to lay their eggs in the little nesting areas back there, and the eggs roll down onto a belt, and the belt carries them out for further processing. But some of the hens don't quite obey the rules, and they lay their eggs wherever they want. And then this boy has to go through and gather them. So that's the few straggler eggs that he's picking up. Other issues. This is a beehive, but not just any beehive. This is, as you see, it's a staging area of many, many beehives in about February in the almond groves of California. So a huge percentage of all the honeybees in America go to the almond groves of California in the early spring to pollinate that crop. And there's all kinds of issues, as you can imagine, with the concentration of almond production in California, from water to pollination, bee health, biodiversity, all kinds of things. But it's part of the story. It's the way it's developed. Now, all those people that I just showed you, they were pretty easy to get in touch with. They have websites in many cases. Many times they've been quoted in newspapers before. They have phone numbers you can call. it's not too hard to get in touch with the owners of farms or the operators of big time, sort of pollination services like the fellow in the almond groves, or academic researchers, plant breeders. They're all easy to get to. But I had an experience a year or so ago when I was doing a story about blueberries, and it was about the history of blueberries, and it had been 100 years since blueberries were actually domesticated as a cultivated crop. And I did my normal thing. I found a blueberry company. They said, "Sure, come on up. We'll show you our operations." Went around the processing house, and I saw the loads of blueberries coming in on trucks from the field. And I asked about, sort of, so who harvests the blueberries? And he told me that it's kind of a crew that comes through. Blueberries have a very short season. So they're there harvesting, the workers are there harvesting blueberries for a time, and then they move on. And I decided, I just have to do more stories that involve the lives of the people who are doing the work. And these are people who often are not easy to get in touch with. They move around a lot. They don't have websites. It's hard to find their phone numbers. And it seemed, if I was talking to employees, it seemed awkward to me to basically reach the employees through their employer. That didn't seem quite right. So I decided I was just going to take the time that was necessary in order to kind of explore the lives of the workers in many different situations. And the way, in the news business, you kind of have to have an excuse to do a story. So I simply took the seasonality of food as my organizing principle. And I said, I'll do a story every couple of months about a seasonal food, but focus particularly on the people who harvest that food. So I believe it was September when I went up to Adams County, Pennsylvania, and visited with some workers in the apple orchards of Adams County, which is a big apple growing area. This is one fella, kind of a random, I didn't actually interview him, but he liked having me take his picture, so that's why the picture's here. These are the people I did talk to. This is Jose Martinez and Matilda Avendano. They spend about half the year in Florida, and then they move to a few other places. Well, two other places, I believe, typically. They come to Adams County, have been coming there for 10 years or so. They have 4 children. So I guess this picture just shows 3 of them. Their young daughter there on the left is quite ill, actually, suffering from childhood leukemia. So one big factor for them in where they settle and for how long is the access to medical care. But they both work in the fields or in the apple orchards. And their children are partly in regular school, and the younger ones are in a Head Start program, which has been actually very helpful for me in getting in touch with workers. There's a federally funded program that pays for Head Start programs specifically for the children of migrant workers. And these centers you can find them in areas where there are a lot of migrant agricultural workers, like in Adams County. I took that picture outside the Head Start Center in Pennsylvania. So that was the story with apples. I moved on to sweet potatoes, and in eastern North Carolina, a big food around Thanksgiving, but increasingly all year round as sweet potatoes become more popular in restaurants. And the sweet potato fries, I'm sure many of those were consumed over Super Bowl weekend. It's an interesting situation in North Carolina because the sweet potato crop turns out to be, for the growers, a good fit with tobacco. Both require a lot of hand labor, And the seasons, it works out so that the workers can move back and forth between the tobacco crop and the sweet potato crop. Um, and so they'll be there. They're there for a pretty long growing season. As migrant agricultural labor goes, it's a long season. And they were just getting to the end of the season when I was there. Harvesting sweet potatoes is the last thing they do, and then they move either back to Florida in some cases, or, and this was kind of a surprise for me when I got there, I found out that a large proportion of the workers in sweet potatoes in North Carolina are here through the so-called H-2A guest worker program. So these are foreign citizens who get visas that are arranged by their employer to come and work for that employer for a specific length of time. So they're here legally, but they can only be here for as long as their visa is, and that's as long as they're needed as agricultural workers by the employers. So it's, the way it's done in North Carolina, it's not done this way everywhere, but in North Carolina, it's bucket crews. Basically, crews of workers go down through the field picking sweet potatoes up by hand, carry them in buckets to a waiting truck, and carry them off to the curing houses, which are sort of hot, humid houses where they sit for some weeks while the skin on the sweet potato kind of firms up. And also the sweet potato, the starch, some of that starch turns to sugar, and they're more palatable. They're better to eat after that curing time. This is one of the workers who I interviewed on that story, Nabor Segundo, and his young son. I didn't, in that sweet potato story, I didn't include the aspect of the guest workers, but I was so struck by it, I decided that, my next story, I would specifically explore that. And it turns out, I found that most of the workers in the citrus groves of Florida are here through this H-2A program, the guest worker program. So this took a little bit of time to set up. My idea was that I would just sort of explore the contrasting lives of the kind of traditional domestically based farm worker and the H-2A worker. Sort of say this is what life is like for each of them, and kind of contrast it. I didn't exactly do that because I got sucked a little bit into the world of policy. I mean, my idea with these stories initially was I was going to do a story about farm workers that was just about the lives of the farm workers. I wasn't going to do stories about immigration policy because, so many stories about farm workers end up being stories about immigration policy. I was thinking I'll do a story about, these people without mentioning whether they're here as legally or not legally. In this story, I kind of couldn't avoid it. So, and the story ended up being mostly about how the guest worker program works, why it has become increasingly popular, and, some what life is like, as a guest worker. But as in the citrus harvest of Florida, apparently, I was told 85% of the workers are now here, through this H-2A program, and that's partly because of the general shortage of agricultural workers, which you hear about really everywhere these days, whether it's California, North Carolina, or Florida. But also because of the problems in the citrus harvest itself, because of citrus greening. The harvest is a little harder to carry out because the yields are down. And so it's become a less attractive job for farm workers. And so if you have a choice, many farm workers avoid it. And that's one of the reasons why the growers have turned to the H-2A program to supply their workers. And then the way it works, once you start using that program, it's just a lot easier for you to just use that program, which actually gets you in problems with the rules of the program, because you're supposed to offer every job to a domestic worker first. And you're only supposed to bring in an H-2A worker if no residents of the United States apply and want to do that job. That's, from what I could tell, that's a bit of a fiction these days, because people are just set up to use H-2A workers, and that's what they plan for, and that's how they recruit. And yes, they fulfill, kind of the legal requirements of the H-2A program, which is they'll put an ad in the paper saying we're looking for workers. But my impression is they don't really want those workers. And they tell me, and I don't know, I can't judge this because I'm not in the business. They say when they do get people applying for those jobs, um, they tend not to stick around. I'm just repeating what they say. So this was part of the scene there. This is in kind of a truck stop sort of place on the road that goes south from the town of LaBelle down to the town of Immokalee. And big old, repurposed school buses drive up here every evening, bringing a load of workers from the citrus groves, drop them off. They go in, order from the taco counter here, and then either kind of go on to the place where they're living, or in some cases, they actually live in a little sort of housing block right behind this truck stop. It's a compound of about 30 houses. You see them in back of this worker here. This is Esteban Gonzalez from Veracruz in Mexico. He lives in one of these yellow houses. There are 10 of them, 10 workers in that house, all kind of bunked up in, the room in back. In the front, there's a kitchen, although the kitchen was not in great working order in the house where he's living. So that's where they live. And the school bus, it's not a school bus anymore. The bus comes in the morning, picks them up, takes them to work, stops somewhere for some food, brings them back in the evening. Oh yeah, that's a better view of the housing complex. So that was kind of my citrus story. In this whole project, there have been a few surprises for me. One is the extent to which workers tell me, I like this work. I'm good at it. I like being out in the fields. I like being out in the orchards. There's camaraderie. As long as there's plenty of work, the pay is, in some cases, not that bad. That was true, actually, at least in the apple orchard. They say the pay is bad in Florida because for labor market reasons, I guess. The pay is just much poorer there. But the stereotypical farm worker story is one of, it's kind of a sad story and one of poverty, and that's true. But when you talk to people, lots of people, there is sadness and there's hardship, but there's also laughter and pleasure in the satisfaction of a job well done, to put it in kind of a cliched way. But it is hard. There's no question about it. Among the hard aspects is if there are children involved, moving from school to school, getting dropped into a new classroom in the middle of the school year. That's not easy. The other interesting thing for me was this issue of finding enough workers is a real one. You run into this everywhere, and there are different strategies for dealing with this worker shortage. One that you could come up with would be, okay, pay more. That's the market solution, right? And then in some commodities, not all, you run into the argument that, well, we're up against competition from Mexico. So we're either going to import workers or import tomatoes. That's the argument you run into. But there are other strategies too, like make the work easier to do, especially for older people, because the workforce is getting older, especially in California. And then finally, and also mechanization. That's certainly been one of the factors driving the boom of the tree crops like almonds in California, is because those are highly mechanized crops and don't actually take a lot of labor. So that's another strategy that people have employed. And finally, I already mentioned this, but I was surprised by the extent of the guest worker program and the extent to which it's growing. I think I'm going to stop at that, and I'm curious whether you have questions. So I am going to switch back to video. I'm thinking you can now see me, and I'd be interested to hear your questions.
Great, thank you, Dan. And that was a great presentation and some great images to go along with it. So we do have a lot of questions from our listeners. So for the next, we have at least 15 minutes to go through as many as possible. So I'll start by asking you, listener wants to know, what life experience prepared you for this kind of work as a food and agricultural reporter? What's your favorite thing about it?
What's my favorite thing about it, or what life experiences prepared me for it, or both of those? Well, the question. I guess every life experience is valuable in some way. Certainly growing up on a farm, I think, was good preparation. I think there's a couple of different things that sometimes get in the way of kind of honest appreciation of agriculture. And that is, for some, there's a bit of a romantic impulse. Growing up on a dairy farm, I couldn't afford to be romantic about it. And I still am not really, even though I do, I'm glad my brother's still there, and I'm glad to go back there, but it's not an easy life. So, and on the other side, I think some reporters tend to have kind of a caricature notion, and I feel like there is some looking down on farmers almost subconsciously, and I don't feel like I do that either. They're scalawags like everybody, many of them, but it's just life. So that, I think, was an important life experience for me. What was the second question? What do I like about it?
Yeah.
Was that the question? Well, the part that's best is when you're actually just out somewhere learning something in a situation where you wouldn't otherwise even think to go. Like the citrus groves. I mean, you have a reason to go places and talk to people and learn stuff. So that's absolutely the best part.
Great. And our next question comes from Stephanie. She asks, what aspects of food do you think NPR audiences care about most? So, for example, entrepreneurship, worker issues, food waste, or other.
Well, it's hard to know, but everything I've seen would indicate that the thing that the general public cares about most is nutrition and how is this food going to affect me. I think many of these other things are interesting to them, but are kind of secondary concern, whether it's environmental impact, the situation of farm workers, lots of other plant breeding, the science of it. I honestly think, even though those are the things that I find very, very interesting, I think those are probably secondary to the general, public. Mostly, is this food bad for me? Is it good for me? And, that sort of thing. That much said, I think that, if you tell a story well, about some of these other aspects, I think, people kind of wake up and say, oh, I had no idea. That's interesting.
Great. And our next question comes, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Laron. And they ask, thank you, Mr. Charles, for doing this type of journalism, especially digging for the deeper stories behind food and agriculture products. I find it very exciting that there seems to be more and more food journalism of high caliber, and with the presidential primary season, there's a lot of political journalism. Food Tank, among other organizations, are trying to raise the profile of food politics as part of this election season, but the fruits of these efforts are still small. How can we, as engaged eaters and media consumers, what can we do to increase journalism at the junction of food, politics, and the presidential race? Thank you.
Ooh, that's a tough question. What can you do to increase it? Consume it. Be interested in it. News organizations, to some extent, respond to their listeners if they get the sense that their listeners are really interested in this topic. They will support it. It's tough, though, I have to say, because it doesn't, sort of the reality of the food you eat, and changing that, it doesn't translate easily through the political process. You can't vote for a senator or even vote for a president, and it doesn't lead directly to, changes in what's on supermarket shelves, because so much of that is a product of, tradition and infrastructure and consumer choice and plain old economics, what people can make a living at doing. So it's a long, slow process. But I agree, the amount of journalism and writing that is available, that people are doing around food, it's much more common, it's more prevalent, and it's also of higher quality, I think, than in years past.
Thanks, Dan. Our next question comes from a listener named Claire. She wants to know, how do you navigate communicating the sensitive or negative sides of food stories? We are challenged with the subject of transparency, and it seems that draws attention to the dichotomy of our food system. But how do we communicate to consumers without stating the, quote, bad?
Well, I think we do state the bad. There is a lot of ugliness in the food system, and there's a strain of journalism that focuses on that. Fast Food Nation, for instance. There's also a lot of joy in it, and I try not to get too sucked into either side, because you want to face the world as it is, and you want to highlight negative and ugly stuff that happens. But at the same time, food is kind of like inherently a wonderful thing, not to mention necessary. It's such an important part of life. So you might as well celebrate it too. So I try to keep both sides in balance.
That's a great answer, Dan. And the next, I'm going to ask two questions from listeners here that both deal with kind of the impact of the work you do. So the first comes from Mike, and he says, "Hi, Dan. I'm really glad your reporting is increasing awareness of the human side of food sustainability. Are you seeing consumers behaving differently with this awareness and knowledge?" And then the other question is from Jill, and she says, "Do you think stories like yours and films such as Food Chains can create difference in food policy, immigration laws, consumer awareness, etc.?"
To both, I would say yes, but within limits. It's one of those things where people pay attention, right? I mean, some people pay attention, but it might be a minority, but it's still worth doing. So, to what extent do consumers pay attention to, for instance, environmental impact? It's a complicated thing because some issues, it's really hard to know what choices to make based on environmental impact. For instance, a huge environmental impact of agriculture is land use. I mean, I often say this, the two things that humans have done that's made the biggest, sort of impact on the planet is probably plowing and draining. So what do you do with that, in terms of food choices? It's hard to know, although you could make an argument, for instance, that since such a, large swath of land is devoted to growing food for animals, maybe that's part of the argument for reducing meat consumption because of the land use argument. That's very kind of, sort of, but land use is a huge thing, but it's a little difficult for many people to know, how does that affect my choices on the supermarket shelf? It's been fascinating to me, though, to see what's happened with eggs and the sudden shift in the egg supply chain toward cage-free eggs. Now you can make arguments back and forth about, what style of housing has what effect on the welfare of chickens. But the fact is, here's an example in which it was consumer driven. That label, cage-free, at least sounded good enough for consumers to really look for it, and it is totally driving, and that consumer preference is totally driving changes in the industry. On some of these other things, immigration and so forth, I'm a little less confident that food choices can have much of an impact.
Thanks, Dan. The next question comes from Eileen, and it's a fun one, in my opinion. So she asks, how does your job affect how you personally eat?
I should have a really simple answer to this question, but I don't. So I'm aware of, various sort of impacts of food. Okay, so here's one simple answer. I know the guy. At my farmer's market, I visited his farm, so it makes me feel good, to go buy food from him. And I visited his farm mainly for work reasons because, I went out there and interviewed him about actually manure. So that's a simple answer. Otherwise, I have to say I am not a super sort of conscientious, eater when it comes to sort of trying to figure out the exact ethical thing to eat when I buy food. I don't know if I should admit this, but I tend to kind of just buy a bunch of stuff. I know a little bit more about where it comes from, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's bad. And I avoid, I mean, I do look at ingredients. I tend to avoid if I see something has a lot of palm oil in it, for instance, because I know the environmental impact of that. I might avoid it. It's all over the map, actually. It's a really mixed bag. Sorry, that's not a very good answer.
That's okay, Dan. I think our Food Tank readers will have a lot of tips for you, though.
I'm sure they do. I'm going to wave my arm and see if I can get the light to turn on in this room again. But
oh, no problem. Okay. So the next question, once again, these two questions are very related, so I'll ask them both. So the first one comes from Mike, and he asks, what are the emerging trends in agriculture that excite you the most? And then Bettina wants to know, please tell us the top 3 stories that need to be told about food.
Emerging trends that excite me the most. It's interesting. It's an interesting question because every trend, I feel like carries both sort of, everything that carries promise. I'm always kind of looking for why it might not be sustainable. But if, for instance, okay, so something that I find just really lovely is the growth in interest in farming among young people, often from non-farming backgrounds. Forever, probably, the main reason people went into farming is because that's what they grew up doing. now, at this moment in the U.S., we have a generation of people, where it's pretty common for young folks to be at least interested in farming and actually get into it, even though they didn't grow up doing it. And I think they bring a whole different spirit to it. I hope they can stick with it. It's not necessarily an easy or well-paid life, but that I found that's very heartening to me, because I think that's a good thing. I'm just going to stop with that trend on that question, I think. But there's a lot of, no, I'll say, I mean, all this interest in, even if it is limited, all this interest in sort of examining the environmental impact of different agricultural practices, I think it's really good. And trying to understand more about sort of the impacts of the food we eat. If that's a trend, I think, that's a really good one. Sorry, what was the second question? What's the top 3 stories that need to be told?
That's right, yes.
Hmm. I have to think about that a little more. I don't usually rank them that way. And I tend to think of like individual stories and not sort of like top trends. I'm going to pass on that. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Our next question might be a little bit easier to answer and is along the same lines. And so, first, our listener, Julie, asks, do you get to decide what stories you pursue or how you decide on your content? And then Joe wants to know, how do you go about finding your stories?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. Yes, there are a lot of stories that I come across or I seek out, but I do have to. It is a group process. I need to go to an editor and say, I would really like to do this. What do you think? And usually they say, yeah, that's a great idea. Go ahead and do that. The main constraint is time, right? Because there are other stories that just kind of fall in your lap, let's say, or something happens and you simply have to do it. And you do want to kind of keep churning out stories. And so you can't just say, I want to spend the next month, doing a story about, I don't know, some particular sort of place in Kansas. That wouldn't fly exactly. So there's the news, things that happen. Let's say, the government comes out with some sort of new food safety regulation. Well, you just have to do it, right? If you think it's important, you do it. Others, people will come to me with ideas and say, what about this? What about that? This afternoon, I'm recording a conversation with the people who put together the Weekend Saturday show, kind of wrapping up some of the developments involving Chipotle and food safety. That was their idea. They'd like to put something on the show about that, so they're going to talk to me about it. Fine, so that was their idea, and that's great. So it's a mixture. I'm human, so the stories that I tend to get most excited about are the ones where it was my idea.
That makes sense. So the next question comes from Katie, and she asks, was there ever a time when you uncovered something you couldn't report on? If so, why?
I can't think of any. I can't think of any examples like that. No.
That's okay. So the next question, once again, is around the same lines. This listener wants to know, what are some examples of major pushback you've received on the stories you have written, if any?
Well, pushback takes different forms. There's the pushback that comes in the form of listener comments at the bottom of the web store, the stories that I do that in their version on the web. And unfortunately, those comments, they can be anonymous, and so those discussions very predictably descend into just mudslinging matches over politics. If you do a story that involves GMOs, you'll get feedback from listeners. Our listeners, judging by the feedback I get, tend to be pretty hostile toward GMOs. So sometimes they think that I'm, not skeptical enough or not critical enough of GMOs. So that's a topic that's always, a hot button. I expected and got a little feedback on some of these farm worker stories from people who don't like the number of immigrants who are here in this country. So there's that form of feedback. But generally, the listeners are pretty polite, and generally they want to enlighten me about the error of my ways, as opposed to kind of attack my motives or say I've been bought and paid for by some, special interest. There's another kind of feedback, which is some company thinks that they've been treated unfairly. That doesn't happen that often. It can happen. You know, on the occasions when that has happened in my memory, we've had a frank exchange of views. They've come in and talked to, top editors. Usually, the attitude you need to take as a reporter is, if I got something wrong, tell me where I was wrong, because I want to put everything, what I put on the air, I want it to be as accurate as possible. And usually we've come to the conclusion that whatever I put on the air was in fact accurate. But, that's the kind of, you do get pushback from every possible corner.
Thanks, Dan. And so, you showed a lot of images of your field work on this most recent story on the seasonal food and the workers behind it. The question reads, how do you build the rapport with the people in your stories in order to build trust and get the truth?
Well, the first step, and sometimes this works, but I think not always, is to try to convince them that you honestly are interested in what they have to say. Because often the suspicion is you know what story you're going to tell already, and you are just there to kind of use them, essentially, use them as a prop in the story that you want to tell. And I don't ever want to do that. So I think all I know how to do is to be as honest as possible. And that includes, so when I go to talk to the citrus grower in Florida, I tell him up front, I'm interested in exploring this H-2A guest worker program. And I want to know what some of the reasons are that you use it. And I am obligated to, I think everybody ultimately in the story should recognize themselves. They shouldn't feel like they were presented in a distorted way. And that's not always easy because the time constraints are such that, you talk to person. I always feel like I have to apologize to the people I talk to, because you talk to them for an hour. They give you an hour of their time. They lay out all kinds of sort of complexity in their story. And then somehow you have to boil that down to, a few minutes on the air. And sometimes their voice may show up for only, 10, 20 seconds. So it's not easy, but all I can say is you do the best you can, and you try not to distort what they had to say. And as far as gaining their trust, I mean, you just have to be as open with them as possible about what you're doing.
Sounds like quite the art form. So we have time for one more question, and then I'd love for you to add anything additional you feel like you want the listeners to know. But the last question is from Olivia, and she asks, the internet and the rise of various social media platforms have opened up new avenues for storytelling, especially stories about our food and experiences. Do you find that these forms of expression have changed storytelling about food, and if so, how? I think of both opportunities and limitations for young farmers, guest farm workers, etc., documenting their experiences via new forms of media.
Yeah, it's true, and they do. You'll find all kinds of interesting storytelling on blogs and links through Facebook and so forth. I mean, it affects us somewhat, to the extent that we're trying to sort of, tell these stories in these different social media. and we don't always do a great job of it. It's not something that it's not how we got into this business, but we're trying to learn these other avenues, and we're not sure how much time to devote to them. But it's helpful for us because we can often kind of find people online who are doing their own storytelling, and then we can in our stories we can link to them, so that if someone comes to my story on the web, they can then sort of find a link to someone's blog or someone's Twitter identity, and that they can get a sort of a richer flavor for what's actually going on um, in the food world. Now, companies obviously try to co-opt these two and do kind of their own sort of image building through those media. So it kind of, in the end, kind of replicates the world, with big corporate presence and individuals, saying their thing. And it's this big old cacophony out there. And I wonder sometimes how many people actually, sort of will find their way through the noise to find some new source. It's a whole different world.
Great. And unfortunately, we're about out of time, Dan, but is there anything additional that you'd like to add for our listeners today?
No, other than to thank you for giving this chance to talk, and I hope it was interesting for people.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and it was truly a pleasure to have you. We're really honored, and thank you to all of our Food Tank listeners for listening in and sending their questions. We did record this webinar, so it will be posted later today on foodtank.com, and you can follow up with me if you have any additional questions, comments, or anything else, feedback, with Sarah at foodtank.com. So thank you again to everyone, and have a great rest of your Wednesday. Bye, Dan.
Bye. Thanks.